The harbor was quiet, too quiet for a place once filled with the roar of engines and the call of gulls. Rusted anchors lay half buried in sand, broken nets sagged over piles of driftwood, and the salt air carried the faint tang of diesel long dried into the boards. The afternoon sun slanted low across the water, turning the waves into sheets of dull bronze. Everything here spoke of endings, boats abandoned to rot, paint peeling like old scars, the echo of lives once lived at sea, now swallowed by silence. From the shadows of the pier, a figure emerged, moving slowly, shoulders rounded against the chill breeze. His coat was frayed at the seams, his boots scuffed from years of wear, but there was a steadiness in the way he walked, a rhythm that still belonged to the tide. His hair streaked with gray, stirred in the wind, framing a face marked by storms far greater than the one settling over the harbor. At his side trotted two dogs, a broad-chested shepherd named Atlas, and a silver-coated husky named Luna, both alert, their ears pricking at every sound. To most eyes, the pier was nothing more than a graveyard of wood and rust, a place where history came to die. Yet the man's gaze locked onto something different. A fishing boat half hidden behind broken pilings, its hull scarred, its mast leaning like a wounded soldier. Where others saw ruin, he saw the faint outline of possibility, a vessel not of decay, but of return. This was no accident, no random discovery. What waited inside that battered shell would alter the course of his weary journey and stir the ashes of a purpose he thought long lost. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Where are you listening to this story from? He stood still, at the edge of the pier, the last rays of sunlight clawing across the ruined boats like fingers of fire. To anyone passing by, he looked like another drifter lost to the decay of this harbor, just one more ghost swallowed by rust and tide. But if you looked closer, you would see the story written on his body. His name was Jonas Keene, 53 years old, once a sailor whose hands had known the wheel of great ships and the raw ropes of storms, now reduced to a man wandering through silence with nothing but two dogs to remind him he was still alive. Jonas's frame was tall but slightly bent, as if the years had pressed their full weight upon his shoulders. His jacket smelled of salt and damp wood, patched so many times it was more stitch than fabric. A thin scar traced the left side of his face, the kind you don't get from an accident, but from survival, the kind that makes strangers turn away. His eyes were pale blue, once bright with the horizon's promise, now clouded with exhaustion. Yet behind them flickered something fragile, something even the storms hadn't drowned, a stubborn spark that refused to go out. Atlas the shepherd pressed close to his leg, steady and protective. Luna the husky circled ahead, restless, her breath fogging in the evening chill. They were more than companions, they were anchors. Without them, Jonas feared he would have already disappeared into the dark water, like so many sailors before him. His past clung to him heavier than the sea salt air. The Navy had given him 20 years of battle and duty, carving discipline into his bones, but also hollowing him out. He'd returned from the service with medals he never looked at, and memories he could never silence. Memories that woke him in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering like gunfire. He thought the ocean would heal him, but instead it mocked him with every crashing wave. When he tried to build a new life on land, it crumbled just as fast. A failed marriage, his wife too tired of waiting, too tired of his absences, of the 1,000-yard stare that followed him home from the sea. A daughter he hadn't spoken to in years, her letters left unopened, in a box he couldn't bring himself to touch. A son who called him a coward the last time they met. And the worst of it all, the workshop he had poured his savings into, hoping to turn old wood into ships of beauty, had collapsed under the weight of debt and despair. The landlord locked the doors. The creditors circled like sharks. Jonas walked away with nothing but a duffel bag, 2 loyal dogs, and a silence that grew louder every day. Now he drifted along this forgotten waterfront, sleeping in the gutted hull of an abandoned skiff, cooking scraps of fish over a dented tin stove. Every morning he woke up with the same question: how much longer can a man go on like this? And yet something held him there that evening, frozen before the wreck of the fishing boat hidden behind broken pilings. It wasn't logic, it wasn't reason. It was instinct, a pull deep in his chest that made his pulse quicken. His hand, rough and scarred, brushed across the railing, as though touching the bones of a long-buried creature. Atlas let out a low growl, not of fear but of warning, and Luna whined, her sharp eyes locked on the shadowy hull. To anyone else, that vessel was just a corpse, splintered wood, corroded bolts, a mast leaning like a man about to fall. But Jonas's breath caught. He didn't just see wreckage. He saw a chance, thin and trembling like the last light of day. A chance to fight back against the tide that had been swallowing him, piece by piece. What lay inside that ruined boat would not only drag Jonas into his past, but also test whether he had the strength left to carve out a future. The harbor had given him one last challenge, and whether it saved him or destroyed him, well, that was a truth waiting in the dark only steps away. Jonas stood before the ruined boat, his hand resting on its cracked hull, when the crunch of gravel on the pier snapped him out of his trance. Atlas's ears shot up a low rumble in his chest, while Luna circled protectively, her hackles raised against the intruder. From behind a wall of rusted crab traps and broken lobster cages, a figure emerged. She was small but sturdy, her gray hair pulled back under a faded red bandana. Her hands were stained with grease, her overalls streaked with old paint and tar. She walked with the deliberate weight of someone who had spent a lifetime wrestling with wood and iron and storms. This was Clara Holt, the last keeper of the harbor's forgotten boats. Jonas didn't speak. He rarely did. But Clara's sharp eyes, sea-glass green, caught the way his fingers lingered over the ruined vessel. She smirked, a dry, knowing twist of her lips. "You've got strange taste," she said, her voice gravelly, shaped by years of salt air and cigarettes. "Most folks don't even look at that carcass anymore. Been rotting longer than I've been retired." Jonas shifted his weight, his dogs bristling. "She's got bones left," he muttered. Clara raised a brow. "Bones? That's generous. She's got splinters and termites. What's a man like you want with her?" Jonas didn't answer. He didn't have an answer, not one he could put into words. It wasn't about wanting. It was about needing. Clara studied him for a long moment. She saw the scars, the weary slope of his shoulders, the way his dogs clung close, as if guarding not just a man, but a wounded soul. She had seen men like him before. Soldiers washed ashore after battles no one else could see, sailors haunted by horizons they could never reach again. "Your Navy," she said at last, not as a question, but as a statement. Jonas looked up sharply, his pale eyes narrowing. "Don't bother denying it," Clara continued. "I can spot it in the way you stand, always braced, like you're waiting for the deck to roll beneath your feet." For the first time in weeks, Jonas almost smiled. It was faint but real. Clara stepped closer, laying a weathered hand on the broken hull. "That boat's been sitting here since '78. Belonged to a family once. Fishermen. They poured their lives into her. When the father drowned, no one touched her again. She's been dying slow ever since." Her words hung heavy in the cold air, as though she were telling a story not about a boat but about him. Jonas's chest tightened. Clara leaned back, crossed her arms, and let the silence stretch until it was taut as a rope in a storm. Finally she spoke again, voice low and edged with something between challenge and compassion. "You want her?" Jonas hesitated. He glanced at Atlas and Luna, both watching him, waiting. The word stuck in his throat. "Yes," he said, almost a whisper. Clara's smirk returned, sharper this time. "Then she's yours. For $1. Jonas blinked, certain he had misheard. $1. "That's right." Clara reached into her pocket, pulled out a tarnished key ring, and held it up. The keys jingled softly, a sound that seemed to echo across the dead harbor. "But there's a catch." Atlas growled softly. Jonas's heart pounded. "You take her," Clara said, "and you make her sing again. You don't let the rot win. You breathe life back into what everyone else has given up on. You do that, sailor, and that $1 will be the best deal either of us ever made." The wind gusted, rattling the chains, moaning through the empty masts like a warning or a blessing. Jonas stared at the keys, at the frail promise of purpose dangling inches from his grasp. His fingers trembled as he reached out. When their hands met, his scarred and calloused, hers steady and unyielding, it wasn't just a deal. It was a pact. A flicker of hope sparked in the hollow places of his chest, dangerous and fragile but alive. He closed his fist around the keys, and for the first time in years, Jonas Keene felt the storm inside him shift. Not calm, not yet, but changing. The journey was beginning. Jonas's hand closed around the ring of keys, their weight heavier than they should have been. He had barely spoken a word to Clara after their pact, but she didn't need words. Her gaze told him she understood the bargain meant more than rusted steel and rotted timber. With Atlas and Luna close on his heels, Jonas stepped aboard the broken fishing boat for the first time, the deck groaning beneath his boots, as if warning him to turn back. Inside, the air was stale, thick with mildew and salt, trapped for decades. Every surface seemed to crumble beneath his touch. Ropes frayed into dust. Nets disintegrated at the slightest pull. The cabin smelled of damp rot and old diesel, its windows crusted with salt that filtered the sunlight into a pale, ghostly glow. Luna sneezed at the dust, while Atlas lowered his head hackles, rising as if he sensed more than decay lingering in these shadows. Jonas set to work. For 3 days he scraped, swept, and tore away the worst of the ruin. Each bag of rotted canvas or splintered wood felt like a battle won, but with every victory came the crushing reminder of how endless the work truly was. His muscles ached, old injuries screamed, and when night fell, he lay sleepless on the pier beside his dogs, staring at the stars that once promised freedom, but now only mirrored the emptiness inside him. On the 4th morning, exhaustion weighed on him like an anchor. His hands blistered raw, his back knotted with pain. He leaned against the bulkhead and felt the futility gnaw at him. "What am I doing?" he whispered. Atlas whined softly, pressing against his side, while Luna's amber eyes fixed on him with an almost human insistence. Still, the despair lingered cold and merciless. That afternoon, Jonas decided to leave the boat and fetch water from town. The walk was long, the streets unfamiliar. At the small post office tucked between shuttered stores, the clerk slid a thin envelope across the counter. Jonas froze the moment he saw the handwriting, delicate loops, careful strokes. His breath caught. It was his daughter's. He had not seen her in years, had not earned a word from her in longer. He carried the envelope like a live coal back to the harbor. Sitting on the pier beside the broken boat, he turned it over in his hands again and again. Atlas nudged his knee. Luna pawed at the boards impatiently. Finally, with trembling fingers, Jonas tore it open. Her words were simple, yet they struck like a storm. She wrote of her job, of her small apartment, of the way life had been moving forward without him. Then the sentence that made the world tilt, "Dad, you're going to be a grandfather." Jonas's chest tightened until he could barely breathe. A grandchild. New life. A piece of the future. For one burning moment, joy surged in him, so fierce it nearly stole his breath. But just as quickly, despair rushed in to smother it. What kind of grandfather was he? A man with nothing. No home, no steady work, no place fit to cradle a child. He had failed his marriage, failed his children, failed every dream he'd ever dared to hold. And now this. The thought was unbearable. His hands shook as the letter slipped from his grip and fluttered to the deck. Atlas whined. Luna barked once, sharp and urgent, breaking the silence. She began pawing at a section of the cabin floor near the gutted galley. Jonas ignored her, at first lost in the swirl of shame. But the dogs grew restless, scratching, whining, their urgency impossible to dismiss. With a sigh, Jonas dragged himself over, grabbed a rusted crowbar, and pried up the warped planks. Beneath, hidden in the darkness, lay a small tin box, its surface dulled with rust but intact. His heart stuttered as he lifted it free. It was heavier than expected. He eased the lid open. Inside lay treasures, not of gold, but of memory. A faded photograph of a family smiling proudly beside this very boat in her prime. A child wearing a paper crown, blowing out birthday candles on the galley table. And beneath the photos, a tiny wooden carving of a seabird, its wings etched with delicate care. tilted in lifelike curiosity. Jonas traced the carving with calloused fingers. A memory slammed into him: a porch on a summer evening, the scent of sawdust and salt, his father's steady hand guiding his own small one with a knife. "Don't force it, son," his father's voice whispered from the past. "The bird's already in the wood. Your job is to set it free." His throat closed, his eyes stung. The despair of the letter, the futility of the labor, all collided with the fragile hope in that little carving. It was as if the boat itself and the family that once lived within her walls were speaking across time, reminding him of who he had been and who he might still become. Jonas clutched the carving tightly, as though it were a lifeline thrown across a storm. Atlas wagged his tail. Luna pressed her muzzle into his palm. And for the first time in years, Jonas felt the faintest tremor of something dangerous, something terrifying, something like hope. Jonas sat frozen on the cracked deck, the tin box open before him, its secrets spilling into the waning afternoon light. The faded photographs trembled in his rough hands, each image whispering of a life that had once thrived within these broken walls. Smiling faces. A girl with missing front teeth holding up a fish almost as big as her. A man and woman with arms looped around each other, their pride glowing brighter than the sun overhead. The little boat, shining new, had carried joy once. Laughter. Family. All the things Jonas had managed to lose along the way. But it wasn't the photographs that undid him. It was the small wooden seabird resting in his palm, its head tilted, wings etched with delicate lines, worn smooth by time and touch. His breath caught as memories tore open, vivid and raw. He was a boy again, no older than 8, sitting on the creaking porch of a house that smelled of pine and salt. His father's hands, large, steady and scarred, wrapped around his smaller ones, guiding the blade across a block of wood. "Don't force it, son," his father's voice echoed deep and calm, carried on the breeze of memory. "The bird's already in there. Your job is just to help it out." The knife had slipped that day, nicking his thumb. He remembered the sting, the drop of blood, and how his father had simply smiled, pressing a cloth against it. "That's part of the work too. You bleed a little, to make something worth keeping." Jonas closed his eyes, the memory searing him. He could almost smell the honeysuckle growing wild behind the porch, hear the distant crash of waves. His father had been gone for decades, claimed by the sea, in a storm that left nothing but an empty chair at the dinner table. And yet, here he was again, alive in the shape of this bird, carved from the same devotion, the same quiet patience his father had tried to pass down. His throat burned. He had spent so many years forcing everything, forcing his body through war, forcing his mind to forget, forcing his hands to build a business meant to prove his worth. And in the process, he had strangled the very gift his father had given him. Wood was never meant to be forced. It was meant to be listened to, respected, revealed. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped listening. Atlas barked, once sharp and urgent, pulling Jonas back to the present. The shepherd's eyes gleamed in the dim cabin, fixed on him, as if urging him to understand. Luna whined, pawing at the tin box, scattering the photographs like fragile leaves across the deck. Jonas gathered them with shaking hands, arranging them carefully back inside, but he held onto the bird. He couldn't let it go. The despair of his daughter's letter still gnawed at him. He was to be a grandfather, yet what did he have to give? No house, no stability, nothing to offer but scars and empty promises. But the bird seemed to whisper a different truth. Maybe his gift wasn't gone. Maybe it had just been buried, waiting. Maybe what he could pass down wasn't money or security, but something more enduring, the craft of hands, the patience of listening, the beauty of shaping life from ruin. He rose to his feet, the cabin swaying beneath him, the seabird clenched tight in his fist. His chest heaved with a mix of grief and fierce determination. The voices of failure screamed in his mind, his wife's last bitter words, his son's accusations, the echo of his workshop door being padlocked by strangers. But beneath those voices, another sound stirred, the rasp of a whittling knife. His father's steady breathing, the lesson of finding what was hidden within. Jonas staggered out into the fading light, Atlas and Luna pressing at his sides. He set the bird gently on the prow of the boat as though offering it back to the sea. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and tar wrapping around him like a challenge. He stared at the wreck of the boat, not as a coffin but as a block of wood waiting to be revealed. It would bleed him. He knew that. His body would break under the strain, his mind would wrestle with the ghosts that never left him. But for the first time in years, the fight felt worth it. Not for glory, not for money, for something smaller, quieter, but infinitely stronger, the hope of handing his grandchild a gift carved from his own redemption. Night fell, hard shadows draping the pier. Jonas lit a lantern, its glow flickering against the splintered boards. He laid out what few tools he had salvaged: dull chisels, a hammer, a knife so rusted it barely held an edge. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But he placed the seabird beside them like a talisman, a reminder of why he couldn't quit. Sleep came fitful, broken by dreams of waves swallowing him whole, of his daughter turning away, of a child he had never met crying out his name. Each time he woke, he touched the bird, grounding himself in its quiet resilience. By dawn he knew what he had to do. This boat would not be restored for profit. It wouldn't be sold or flaunted. It would become a home, a sanctuary, a vessel of memory and love. And in its rebirth he would find his own. Jonas lifted the bird again, sunlight catching on its carved wings. His father's words whispered once more, steady and unrelenting. "Don't force it, son. Just set it free." Tears blurred his vision, but he smiled through them, a small, trembling smile, fragile as glass, yet stronger than steel. For the first time in a long time, Jonas Keene felt alive. The seabird still rested on the prow, when the sound of tires crunching gravel broke the quiet of the harbor. Jonas looked up from his work, sawdust clinging to his sweat-soaked shirt. A sleek sedan rolled to a stop at the edge of the pier, its polished surface out of place among rust and ruin. His chest tightened. He knew that car. The doors opened. His daughter Emily stepped out first, her hand unconsciously resting against the swell of her stomach. Even beneath her guarded expression, she looked so much like her mother, bright eyes dulled now by worry. Beside her stood Michael, Jonas's son, taller, broader, carrying the same stubborn jawline he had once seen in the mirror. But Michael's face was hard, his arms crossed tight, as though bracing against disappointment he had long expected. "Dad," Emily said softly, her voice trembling. "We've been looking for you." Jonas swallowed hard. "I'm here," he answered, though it felt inadequate, small against the weight of years lost. Emily's eyes darted to the gutted boat behind him, then to the makeshift pile of tools, the ragged tarp flapping in the wind. "What is this?" she asked, almost pleading. "You're living here." "In this wreck," Jonas tried to smile, to explain. "It's not a wreck. Not anymore. It's a beginning. I'm rebuilding her, making her something worth keeping." He gestured toward the hull, toward the seabird he had placed like a guardian. "It's for you, for the baby, for all of us." But Michael's laugh cut sharp through the air. It wasn't humor, it was anger. "A beginning. This is the same delusion all over again. The workshop, the debts, the nights we went hungry because you were too busy chasing a dream. You think we forgot?" His voice rose, echoing across the empty harbor. "You don't change, Dad. You just run from war, from Mom, from us." The words struck like blows. Jonas's throat constricted, his breath uneven. "It's different this time," he forced out, but the certainty faltered. "No," Michael snapped, stepping closer, his eyes blazing. "It's exactly the same. Another obsession. Another failure waiting to happen. And we'll be the ones left to pick up the pieces." Emily flinched, torn between her brother's fury and the fragile hope in her father's eyes. "Please, Dad," she whispered. "Come home with us. Don't do this alone. We can help you." Her words, though gentle, carried their own sting. To Jonas, they sounded less like compassion and more like pity, a verdict that he was broken beyond repair. The tightrope of hope he had been walking trembled, threads fraying beneath his feet. Atlas barked sharply, sensing his master's collapse. Luna pressed against Jonas's leg, her amber eyes fixed on him, as if to remind him not to sink. But the silence that followed was suffocating, filled with every failure, every abandonment, every scar. Emily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Michael's face hardened into stone. And in that moment, Jonas felt the boat behind him shift from sanctuary to coffin. A symbol not of redemption, but of the cycle he could never escape. Jonas stood there hollow, watching the taillights of his children's car vanish down the long stretch of road beyond the harbor. The echo of their words still clung to the air, heavy and merciless. For a long moment he didn't move. His shoulders sagged, his hands hung limp, and the fragile ember of hope he had guarded so carefully now felt smothered under the weight of their doubt. Atlas whimpered, pacing in restless circles. Luna pressed against his leg, nudging his palm with her muzzle. But even their loyalty felt like it couldn't reach the black tide rising inside him. He turned toward the boat, once a vessel of promise, now looming like a cruel reminder of failure. He thought of letting it rot, of walking away into the dark, and letting the sea take the rest of him. A voice broke the silence. Low, rough, steady. Don't listen too hard to ghosts. Jonas turned sharply. Clara stood a few yards away, her frame outlined against the glow of her lantern. She must have seen everything, every bitter word, every blow that had left him staggering. For a moment, he bristled, ashamed at being witnessed in defeat. But her gaze wasn't pitying. It was steady, sharp, alive, with something he hadn't felt in a long time: respect. Clara walked forward, her boots crunching against gravel, and stopped in front of him. She didn't mention Emily's tears or Michael's fury. She didn't echo the words that had cut him open. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her overalls and pulled out a heavy ring of keys. They jingled as she held them out, catching the faint light. "Tool shed," she said simply. "My husband's old shop. Hasn't been opened in years. Saw sander drills, all still good enough to make wood sing, if the right hands hold them." Jonas stared at the keys, his throat tight. His instinct was to refuse. Pride, shame, fear, all tangled together in a knot that threatened to choke him. "Why?" he rasped. Clara shrugged, but her eyes didn't waver. "Because I know the look in your eyes. I've seen men broken, yes, but I've also seen men who refuse to stay broken. You've still got fight in you, sailor. I'm betting those hands can build more than just excuses." Her words hit with the force of a wave. Not pity, not judgment. A wager, a challenge, and beneath it a flicker of faith. Jonas's hands trembled as he reached for the keys. The cold metal pressed into his calloused palm felt like an anchor, something solid in the storm. Atlas barked, once tail wagging, as if he too understood the gravity of this moment. Luna gave a low, approving whine. Clara's expression softened just slightly. "Don't prove them wrong," she said, nodding toward the empty road where his children had disappeared. "Prove yourself right. That's the only victory worth a damn." For the first time since their visit, Jonas straightened. The despair clinging to him didn't vanish, but it loosened, giving him breath. He closed his fist around the keys, felt their weight settle into him like a promise. The night wind carried the scent of salt and old iron, as Clara turned and walked back into the shadows, leaving him alone with the boat, the dogs, and the ring of keys. Jonas stood in silence, the world around him shifting in some small but profound way. The anger of his son, the pity in his daughter's eyes, they still echoed. But now another sound rose louder, the faint hum of a saw, the hiss of sandpaper, the rhythm of creation, waiting to be reclaimed. Jonas looked back at the boat, battered but unbowed. His fingers tightened around the keys until the edges dug into his skin. For the first time in years, the storm inside him didn't push him toward surrender, it pushed him toward work. And somewhere deep in the marrow of his bones, he understood he wasn't finished. Not yet. The keys dug into Jonas's palm all night, their cold weight refusing to let him sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard Michael's voice, sharp, with judgment echoing against the hollow of his chest. But then Clara's words cut through, steady, unyielding. "Don't prove them wrong. Prove yourself right." By dawn, Jonas was moving. Atlas barked, once tail wagging, while Luna bounded toward the tool shed Clara had unlocked for him. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, but the sight stole Jonas's breath. A table saw, scarred and sturdy, sanders lined neatly on a shelf, chisels dulled but waiting. These weren't just tools, they were lifelines, relics of another craftsman who had once believed in building more than tearing down. Jonas set to work. At first, every strike of the hammer felt like a fight against himself. His body ached, old wounds screamed, and the ghosts of failure hovered over his shoulder. But as the hours passed, rhythm replaced doubt. The hiss of the sander, the rasp of saw, teeth through pine, the deep vibration of nails driven home. It became a music, and his hands remembered what his heart had almost forgotten. The transformation began slowly. Rotten planks came out, hauled into piles that Atlas guarded like trophies. Luna trotted back and forth with scraps of rope, as if she too wanted to be part of the rebuilding. Fresh wood took its place, golden. In the sunlight, the scent of clean sawdust, chasing out mildew's stench. Each day the boat changed, but more importantly, Jonas changed. His back straightened, his eyes sharpened, his silence no longer hollow, but purposeful. Where despair had lived, determination now dug in its roots. There were moments that nearly broke him, when a beam split in two, after hours of shaping, when rain seeped through a half-finished roof, when exhaustion left him trembling on the pier. Each time he felt the old voices creep back. You'll fail again. You always fail. But then he would glance at the little wooden seabird perched by his tools. He would run a thumb over its smooth wings, hear his father's voice, whisper, "Don't force it, son. Just set it free." And he would rise again. Weeks bled into months. Slowly, impossibly, the ruin became something else. Fresh paint gleamed cream and forest green against the harbor's rust. Windows cleared of grime, let golden light spill across newly paneled walls. Inside, Jonas rebuilt with care a narrow bunk that smelled of cedar, a galley table sanded smooth, a small shelf where he placed the seabird as guardian of the vessel's heart. And one crisp autumn evening, Jonas stood back on the pier and hardly recognized what he saw. Where once a carcass of wood and rust had leaned toward collapse, now stood a home. Not perfect, not polished, but alive, stitched together by sweat scars and stubborn hope. Atlas stretched out proudly at the gangway, Luna curling beside him, both dogs watching their master with quiet devotion. Jonas's chest swelled not with pride exactly, but with something deeper, peace fragile but real. For the first time in years, he had built something that would not be taken by war or debt or despair. He had carved order from chaos, life from ruin. And standing there in the lantern's glow, Jonas Keene realized he was no longer restoring just a boat. He was restoring himself. The boat gleamed in the autumn sun cream and green paint, catching the light like new skin over old scars. Jonas stood on the pier, wiping sawdust from his hands, the seabird carving resting on its shelf inside the cabin. Atlas stretched lazily near the gangway, while Luna dozed in a warm patch of light. For the first time in years, there was silence inside Jonas's chest. Not the silence of emptiness, but the calm of something whole. Then he heard it, the distant crunch of tires on gravel. His body tensed, heart thundering in his ribs. He wiped his palms on his shirt, suddenly unsure if he was ready. A familiar sedan rolled to a stop. The same one that had carried his children away weeks before, their faces hard, their words cutting him down. Now it sat idling at the edge of the harbor, engine humming like a held breath. The doors opened. Emily stepped out first, her hands folded protectively over her belly. Behind her, Michael emerged, arms still crossed, jaw still tight, but his eyes flickered uneasily toward the boat. For a moment they both stood frozen, as if unable to believe what they were seeing. Jonas forced himself to move. He walked down the gangway slowly, every step echoing like a drumbeat of doubt. "Come on," he said quietly, his voice catching. "See what I've built." They followed. Inside the cabin, sunlight streamed across polished wood. The bunk smelled of cedar, the galley table shone smooth as glass. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive, a sanctuary carved out of ruin. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming. Michael's posture faltered, the stone wall around him cracking as his gaze swept over the room. On the table lay 3 gifts. Jonas picked up the first, a small jewelry box of dark mahogany, its lid carved with a blossoming vine. He placed it gently into Emily's hands. "For you," he said, "a place to keep what matters." Her fingers traced the carving, tears spilling silently. Next he lifted a delicate mobile strung with tiny wooden animals. A fox, a rabbit, a bear, and a seabird, just like the one on his shelf. The figures turned slowly in the light. For the baby, he whispered, his voice breaking. Emily pressed the gift to her chest, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Finally, Jonas picked up a heavy oak toolbox, solid and practical, built to last a lifetime. He held it out to his son. For you, Michael. Strong enough to build or mend whatever you need. Michael stared at it, his throat working. His hands closed around the box, feeling the weight, the craftsmanship, the honesty in every joint and edge. His eyes lifted to his father's. For the first time in years, they softened. I was wrong, Michael said hoarsely, his voice thick with emotion. I thought you were running again. But you built this. You built yourself back. Jonas's eyes blurred. He stepped forward, and Michael met him halfway. The embrace was clumsy, fierce, years of anger dissolving into something raw and human. Emily joined them, wrapping her arms around them, both tears wetting Jonas's shoulder. Atlas barked once Luna pressed her muzzle against Michael's leg, and the cabin filled with something it had not known in decades: family. Jonas closed his eyes, holding them close, the seabird's shadow falling across them like a blessing. For the first time, he wasn't a man defined by loss. He was a father, a grandfather. And together, they were whole again. As Jonas held his children in that fragile, trembling embrace, the boat around them no longer seemed like wood and nails. It was proof that broken things could live again. His story reminds us that true worth is never measured in money or possessions, but in the love we rebuild from ruins, the forgiveness we dare to seek, and the families we choose to heal. If this journey touched you, please support us by subscribing, liking, or sharing your thoughts in the comments, so together we can keep bringing more stories of hope and redemption to life.